Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Raminder Gill and welcome to my channel Physics by Dr. Gill. We have discussed in our previous video how to make laws of physics and how to write equation of motion for the simplest system known to us like coin and dice. And I told you that we don't need infinite number of objects to have infinite number of states. We need one object and we can rearrange that object in an infinite number of ways. So today we will discuss what are allowable and non-allowable laws of physics. Let's start. Let me draw a picture of non-allowable or unallowable laws. It's completely deterministic. It's completely predict the future, but there is something different about it. And then the laws that I have written for coin and dice. So today we are going to discuss the unallowable laws, and those laws will be different for the laws that I have already written for the coin and dice. So I'm going to do it by drawing the picture for it. We can make many examples, but for this particular example or particular system, it's got three states. So, or we can say this is a three-sided coin. It gets heads, tails, and edges. Here there is law of something that we will not allow in physics. How? Here I'm drawing the arrows just like this. Head goes to tails, tail goes to edges, and edges goes back to tails, not goes back to heads. So wherever you start, the history is completely predictive. Means if I start with tails, it goes to edges, and edges to tails, then again tails to edges. If I start with heads, it goes to tails, then edges, and then tails. Or we can write it as heads to tails, tails to edges, edges to tails, and again to edges. But if you will start with tail, then how would be the history? It will be just like tails to edges, then tails, then edges, then tails. Or if you will start with edges, then it will be go to tails, edges, tails, edges, tails. So here you can see that here and here there is no head. How? Why? Because we are starting with tails and it goes to edges and then it goes to tails. And if you will start with edges, it will go to tails and then it will go to edges. Now what's the odd about this law? The odd about this law is that it is completely predictive into the future, but it is not predictive into the past. So to speak, if you know that you are at tails, you don't know from where you come from. Did you know you come from edges? If you are at tails, maybe you come from edges, and maybe you could have also come from heads. आप हो सकते हैं आप यहाँ से आए हैं या यहाँ से आए हैं. So while you can predict the future in this case, but you can't tell about past from this law of motion, or you can say from this law of physics. One configuration or several configuration one या several configuration run into the same configuration, and so you can't tell if you are over here whether you come from here or you come from here, कि आप यहाँ से आए हैं या यहाँ से आए हैं. तो इतनी सारी कॉन्फ़िगरेशन है, बट आपको ये नहीं पता कि टेल्स पे आने के लिए इधर यू कम फ्रॉम हेड्स. आपका पास्ट क्या है, क्या आपका पास्ट हेड था या आपका पास्ट क्या था, एज था. फॉर दिस इट्स दैट इट इज नॉट रिवर्सिबल. Here's the way to think about its reverse every arrow. Suppose I am now going to reverse every arrow in this picture. Then how can you draw this picture then? Here again I am going to draw heads, tails and edges. Now if you are reversing it, then tails to heads, tail to edges, and then यहाँ tail to edges, and it will be go just like this, edges to tail. For this it's now क्या है, here's the way to think about its reverse. अगर हमने reverse कर दिया, now you have an unpredicted situation. How? कैसी अनप्रेडिक्टेड सिचुएशन है. इफ यू आर एट टेल्स, यू डोंट नो वेदर टू गो टू हेड्स और वेदर टू गो टू एजेस. सो इट्स प्रेडिक्टिव सिचुएशन वन वे बट नॉट रेट्रोएक्टिव द अदर वे. Retroactive means the word for this is not reversible. You can go one way but not the other way. This is a kind of law that is not allowed in physics. Do you know why we are discussing allowable and non-allowable laws of physics in the lectures of classical mechanics, and why I have chosen such a simple system like coin and dice to explain about all these laws? And also I have tried to write equations of motion for these simple systems. Why? Because if we have perfectly predictive system of equation, it won't allow us to be completely predictive. If you don't know the initial conditions exactly, so it means we need to know two things to predict the future. One is what the rules or laws, and one is what the initial conditions are. Now in these very simple systems like coin and dice, it's easy to imagine that we could know exactly what the initial conditions are. How? Just by tossing or flipping the coin. Or just look at the coin, we know what the initial condition perfectly. But in the real world, where we are faced with degree of freedoms, means the number of independent variables that define the positions or motion of a mechanical system in space. Any number of numbers, the positions and velocities of all the particles in the world, you can never know them perfectly, no matter how precise you measure the location of the particle, you still don't know it exactly. So there's always a degree of uncertainty in your knowledge of the initial conditions, because small changes in what the initial conditions are may or may not give rise to large changes in what happens in the future. So the right way to say that if you know the initial conditions perfectly, then you could predict the future forever, And even in a true classical mechanical system, you could also predict the past perfectly. But if you have imperfect knowledge of the initial conditions, you have to determine that how imperfect is it. And if you can determine it, it may allow you to answer the question how long into the future you can predict the things. For example, if you know enough about the initial conditions of the atmosphere, you might be able to predict the weather for 3 days. But because of your knowledge is limited, and because of the atmosphere is one of these systems whose little errors whose little errors build up, उसमें कोई भी एरर हो सकती है एटमॉस्फेयर में, दे कॉल्ड chaotic और disordered. इट मीन्स वो सिस्टम क्या है, chaotic है, उसमें डिसऑर्डर हो सकता है. Because atmosphere is chaotic or disordered, no matter how well you know the initial conditions, it is always true that if you wait long enough, you won't be able to predict the future. On the other hand, if I want to be able to predict the future for X number of years, it should be possible to say how precisely you have to know the initial conditions. So, when we come to the real world, this idea of predictability becomes a little more complicated. But I started on purpose with very simple discrete systems. The laws of classical mechanics are not only deterministic into the future, but they deterministic into the past also, which makes them reversible. Now, how do you look at one of these pictures and decide this picture or this picture? How can you decide whether it is a legal law or not? इसे देखकर, इस पिक्चर को देखकर और फिर इस पिक्चर को देखकर आप कैसे बता सकते हैं कि ये लीगल अलाउबल लॉ है या नहीं है? वेल, इट्स वेरी सिंपल. इफ एवरी स्टेट, जैसे ये स्टेट है, ये स्टेट है, ये स्टेट है, इफ एवरी स्टेट has one outgoing and one incoming arrow, that means that you know from where it came from or where it's going. For example, if I am drawing it again, this picture, head, tail and edges, and head goes to tails, tail goes to edges and edges goes to heads. Now you know that each state has one incoming and one outgoing. For example, for this, head से कहाँ जा रहा है, tail में जा रहा है, तो one outgoing and incoming कहाँ से हो रही है, edge से, head में. tail के लिए अगर हम देखें, incoming head से हो रही है और यहाँ से क्या हो रहा है, इसकी outgoing हो रही है. अगर मैं किसके लिए देखूँ, edge के लिए देखूँ, तो यहाँ से इनकमिंग क्या है, टेल से यहाँ हो रही है और आउटगोइंग कहाँ हो रही है, एज से हेड में हो रही है. सो इफ यू वांट टू नो वेदर इट इज अलाउएबल, लीगल लॉ इन द सेंस दैट आई हैव डिफाइंड, और इफ यू वांट टू नो वेदर इट इज रिवर्सिबल, लुक एट द एरोस ओनली. आपने एरो को देखा, उसी से आपको पता चल गया. एंड इफ ईच स्टेट has only one incoming and only one outgoing, then it's both deterministic and reversible. तो अगर हर स्टेट की क्या है, एक इनकमिंग है और एक क्या है आपकी आउटगोइंग है, इट मीन्स वो लॉ क्या है, डिटर्मिनिस्टिक भी है और रिवर्सिबल भी है. ओके, सो लेट्स सॉर्ट ऑफ warm up preliminary about what classical mechanics is about. It's about the predicting the future. So that's all for today. I will meet you in my next lecture with some complex systems like particle moving around us, these type of complex system, and then we will try to write the equation of motion for the same. But before going, if you like my videos, please subscribe my channel and like and share also. If you have any doubt regarding any lecture, you may comment me in the comment section or can also mail me at the mailing ID given in the description box. Thank you so much.